So I met Blaine 6 years ago when I started at the University of Miami, and so I was really excited to meet him. We have a joint passion for Aristotle's ethics, and we discovered we have sort of parallel research desires to mine Aristotle's ethics for insights about virtue and eudaimonia, and bring them into contemporary research. And so Blaine's done a lot of that in psychology, and I'm sort of been starting out doing that in moral philosophy. So we've learned a lot from each other. We organized an interdisciplinary conference on eudaimonia, and we've been looking for other avenues to collaborate. So we're really excited about this project. I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting us to come and give this talk. So on to our project. So our project is Virtues as Properly Motivated Self-Integrated Traits. So what I want to do is talk a little about the innovative aspects of our project as I describe it. So there's sort of two rough categories of innovative aspects. There are things about the project concept and design, and then there's a larger interdisciplinary goal we have. So in terms of the project concept and design, we deploy a new, or parts of it are very new, we think, theoretical and conceptual model for virtue traits. And what we want to do is we want to come up with a better model for virtue traits so that we can then deploy cutting-edge design methods to measure virtue traits' presence or not in people's lives. The larger interdisciplinary goal is to reframe debates about virtue or full virtue being a psychologically realistic goal for human beings. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little about the new theoretical conceptual model, then Blaine's going to fill in the research methods we're going to use to try to measure virtue traits, and before that I'm also going to mention some stuff about the realistic goal debate, and Blaine will come back to that. So if you're thinking about our theoretical or conceptual model for virtue, the thing that sort of typifies our approach is we think we should focus on degrees, not minimal conditions. So the idea here is that we want to come up with a model for measuring various ways in which people can have degrees of virtue. So here's sort of a little rough picture of this. So we think, if you think of a virtuous activity at a time or a virtuous action, we think, well, drawing on Aristotle, there's at least the following cognitive, motivational, perceptual, and behavioral aspects. And so you could exhibit more or less virtue at a time if you have all of those dimensions, and a little bit less virtue at a time if you have only some subset of them. Okay, so that's an time slice. Then there's also a question of over time, diachronically in your life. Do you display that virtue at the same degree? So those different amounts that you could be full or less at a time, those can also show up over time. Do you regularly exhibit it at the same degree? Then there's also a question about consistency over time in contexts of the same type, and then there are questions about consistency in different types of contexts. And the thing we'd like to do is actually try to find ways to empirically measure this in people's actual lived experiences in their lives, not in terms of one-time questionnaires about global self-assessment or sort of how they operate in specific situations. So here we're largely inspired by a density distribution model that's been developed in psychology that Blaine will talk about how we're going to use it. Okay, so what I want to talk about, though, next is some of the aspects of virtue we want to measure. And so we think motivation matters. And so one thing we really want to capture, which was talked about in the last talk, is Aristotle's virtue continence distinction. So the idea here is if one person performs a kind act for good reasons, but they hate doing it, they make themselves do it, that does exhibit some degree of virtue. But if another person performs this action of the same type for the same reasons, but they enjoy doing it and they take great pleasure in it, that has more virtue. So that's one dimension of greater or less virtue at a time. Another thing we're going to measure is virtue as self-expression. So here again, we think full virtue embodies the core commitments or core evaluative commitments of the self. So you can imagine someone who maybe at one time they perform a kind action for good reasons, maybe they even enjoy it, but it's against what they take to be their better judgment, or it's at odds with their core evaluative commitments. Okay, we think that has some degree of virtue to it, but there's even more virtue if the person acts in the same way, but it's in line with their core commitments and their evaluative judgment. So those are the kinds of things we want to measure at a time and how they vary over time. Okay, so that's a little bit about our theoretical conceptual model. Blaine's going to talk how this is going to work on the ground. So I want to say a little bit how this model will allow us to reframe debates about virtue being psychologically a realistic goal. So there's a lot of debate in philosophy, anyway, about what empirical psychology can tell us about whether virtue is a psychologically realistic goal. I think a lot of it's centered around people like John Doris and Christian Miller. They basically argue as follows. They stipulate necessary conditions for something like full virtue. Then they argue there's empirical evidence that people do not meet those necessary conditions. Okay, Blaine and I are skeptical that their data shows what they say it does. We also have worries about the necessary conditions they stipulate. We think the whole approach is wrong-headed. We need to move to a degree of virtue model, and then we can ask questions like, how much virtue can people realistically achieve? Okay, is there a threshold? Can they get to full or not? That's one question, but we can ask degrees. The other thing I want to point out is Doris and Miller seem to us underinterested in the social processes that might lead to an inhibition of the ability to develop full virtue. And here, I think there's an interesting neglected alternative form of skepticism about our ability to develop full virtue that you find in some of Alistair McIntyre's early work. He actually helped with empirical studies in the 70s and wrote a lot about this. He posits the existence of what he calls compartmentalization, and he argues that causes a lack of virtue. Compartmentalization, roughly, is the idea you display one set of traits and think about yourself one way when you're a parent, another when you're in your role as maybe a CEO. That was actually the group he studied. Maybe another group while you're with your friends. And there's a worry that if you compartmentalize in this way, he thinks that's going to impede the development of full virtue. So what he says is compartmentalization impedes reflection on the core commitments of yourself and their embodiment across all your contexts. And he thinks this reflection is necessary for the development of full virtue. So ultimately, we'd love to test all those hypotheses that he's giving. What we want to focus on is try to get empirical data. Is there a compartmentalization effect in people? Do they compartmentalize in different social roles, or do they compartmentalize in different contexts? And then we can say, does that correlate with whether people are embodying the virtue of self-expression or not? So we want to start testing that, and that's our larger goal, is to try to advance more of the questions here. So I'm going to turn it over to Blaine.
Thanks for that great conceptual introduction, Brad. That sets the stage really nicely. Of course, all of us face the major challenge of trying to reconcile the depth and subtlety of virtue philosophy with the concrete constraints of, in our case, a high-quality psychological investigation that allows us to capture the real-world meaning of virtue. We propose 6 research design strategies for incorporating the philosophy of virtue into our study. First, we will assess behavior associated with 2 virtues, kindness and fairness. One trade-off between assessing many virtues superficially and assessing just a few virtues intensively is one of the ones that we faced. And we chose depth so that we could do a more intensive kind of exploration. And then we're thinking that this study can be a generative model for future studies of other virtues. Second, we will assess the degree of traitness of the virtues in their level of behavioral expression and consistency within individuals over time in an intensive longitudinal study. Virtue research has relied too much on global self-reports, questionnaires, and analyzing aggregate data. Within-person assessment is the only way to truly assess traits because standard aggregate analyses only assess relationships among variables between persons. Traits are things that happen within persons. So we're making that distinction between person and within-person analyses. Moreover, high-quality trait assessment includes assessment at multiple time points. And to date, we have only 2 studies that have used this innovative methodology, and we want to build on the work that these investigators have already done. So specifically, we'll use experience sampling methods, or ESM, to study adult participants from the community. ESM assesses psychological and behavioral occurrences intensively over time, and we're very fortunate to have on our team Jean-Philippe Laurenceau, a nationally recognized expert in these methods. Participants will complete 4 assessments every day over a 14-day period, and each report will include assessments of the degree to which participants acted fairly or kindly in the past 2 hours. This will allow us to gather up to 56 assessments per person. We will adopt Fleeson and his colleagues' density distribution approach to trait assessment, which is the cutting-edge model for studying traits through behavioral manifestations. The density distribution of virtue-related behaviors provides 3 forms of evidence of a trait structure. So what you get is a sampling of behaviors over time, and it may not look as pretty as this, but you'll get a distribution of the strength of virtue responses over time, and from that we can derive a mean. What's the level of virtue responses? We can figure out what the variation is, what's the standard deviation of those virtue responses within persons, and research in this area has consistently found a great deal of variation in any kind of trait responses. And then we can also look at the consistency over time in individual responses, and this is a key variable for a trait, that it shows up in a consistent way. And again, the research has been remarkable in showing strong correlations over time. The other thing we can do is we can look at individual differences in these traits with this method. So the hypothesis that flows from this is that there will be a great deal of within-person variation in virtue, behavior, motivation, and self-integration. So people aren't going to be just one way all the time. And this is one of the problems with Doris's analyses, is that he assumes that that's the case, and it just isn't. So we have to take situations into account. We also expect strong within-person consistency over time in these variables. The two density distribution studies of virtues so far have really focused on virtue-related behaviors. This is a great start, but we all know that mere behavior is not a strong indicator of virtue. So therefore, we have included motivation, virtue motivation in our study, and this will include three aspects of motivation at each time point. So it'll be the goal, the type of motivation, and the felt immediate motivation during the activity. So this explicit inclusion of motivation is unique in the longitudinal assessment of virtue. The concordance of motivation and behavior is central to virtue, and continence is defined by acting well with discordant motivation. We expect substantial individual variation in the relationship between virtue-related behavior and motivation, and that should correspond to greater virtue or more people going more on the side of continence. So we think we'll be able to actually identify that distinction for the first time empirically. Fourth, virtue should be well integrated with the self, and at each time point in the study, we will assess the self-congruence and self-expressiveness of the behavior. This will be the first longitudinal assessment of self-congruence, self-expression, and virtue. We expect moderately strong within-person correlations among virtue-related behavior, motivation, and self-processes, and that constitutes a pretty strong challenge of a robust view of virtue. So by going to this within-person analysis, we're able to look at this kind of concordance within these things that is theorized but really hasn't been studied so far. So higher mean scores and higher correlations among virtue-related behavior, motivation, and self-integration suggest a higher degree of virtue. Fifth, we will assess some situational factors, such as social setting and the social relationships active at each time point in the study. We expect virtue-related behavior, motivation, and self-integration to be stronger in private than in public settings, and stronger in personal than in stranger relationships. So this follows some of McIntyre's ideas that Brad alluded to, and so we're going to be able to test this compartmentalization of virtue in modern contexts. Finally, we will purposefully select, oops, I'm a little behind here. Now I caught up. We'll purposely select extreme cases for narrative interviews based on our quantitative data to further assess this integration. So we'll select 5 participants who have among the highest scores on the virtue measures and 5 who have among the lowest scores in these virtue measures. And we'll do narrative interviews that will focus on the individual's self-understanding of kindness and fairness, and explore how the individual came to approach social situations in the indicated ways. We will analyze interview transcripts with grounded theory methods, and we expect different stories about kindness and fairness in these two groups. So combining the intensive longitudinal quantitative data with in-depth qualitative data is an unprecedented enrichment in studying the integration of self, motives, and virtues through mixed methods. We'll use a multi-level modeling approach with the quantitative data, and so we've got 3 levels of this. So settings are nested within individuals, and then behavior, motivation, and self are nested within settings. And multi-level modeling is particularly appropriate for studying virtues because the focus, again, is on within-person variability, making trait assessment possible. Moreover, we can examine within-person relationships among behavior, motivation, and self-integration. So we do anticipate some methodological challenges. Among those are sampling, and most studies tend to use undergraduate samples that we've talked about, and there's some real problems with that. We are going to recruit a national sample of adults with a variety of age ranges, and we're going to employ a survey company such as Qualtrics to help us do that data collection. And we will train and monitor our participants in using cell phone apps to record the data. So we'll watch to make sure that they're actually doing it, and we'll provide training for them. Scale construction is another challenge. Part of the problem is that almost all of the scales available are made for between group analyses, so we have to create the kind of scales that will detect within individual variability. And we also have the challenge of social desirability. So we're going to meet that in 3 ways, which I have to say very, very fast. We're going to do scale development, and that's built into our timeline. We're going to use our expertise in this, and we're going to build on the models of other ESM researchers. And finally, we're going to do pilot testing with 2 samples to get that underway. Thank you very much.
Longitudinal, when you're talking about 14 days, that doesn't seem to really be longitudinal to my thinking, and I'd appreciate a comment on that. Also, as a second question here, is obviously you're talking within the individual, and hence you're totally relying on what that individual reports about their own behavior, their own thoughts, their own views, and so forth. And that troubles me, because self-report has just been shown again and again to be notoriously problematic for different reasons. So could you please address those 2 issues?
Absolutely. Those are great questions. They're questions I would have liked to have talked about in a 50-minute talk, but couldn't do in 10 or 9. So I'm glad you asked them. First of all, the idea of longitudinal, there are different ideas about longitudinal, as I'm sure you understand. Some people think of longitudinal as 20 years or 30 years, something like that. And that's certainly a legitimate perspective. But the basic definition of longitudinal, particularly within the ESM view of research, is that you're collecting at least 5 data points over time. And so it doesn't have to be a long period of time. What really matters, this form of research is more about intensive longitudinal study as opposed to longitudinal period. So in other words, you could have 3 data collection or 5 data collection points over 20 years. That would be longitudinal, but 4 time points, 14 days is also longitudinal by that definition. So it's a different way of looking at it. Second thing is, yeah, the worry about self-report and social desirability is an important one. We're going to take a good look at that in our pilot studies. It's one of the main things we want to look at to make sure that our responses are not overly driven by social desirability. In the general ESM literature, what we find is that it's really actually helpful to ask people about small increments of behavior and time, because they're much less likely to feel like they have to gloss that in a socially desirable way. So if I say, well, I was impatient as a parent during the last 2 hours, that's one thing, but if you give me a global self-report and ask if I'm a patient parent, I'm going to give a different answer. So one of the ways that it helps is that we are asking about these small increments, and people are less likely to distort their responses. That's what a lot of investigators have found.
Howard?
So I want to follow up on the measurement question because I share some of these concerns, but more than that, if you're densely sampling the same kinds of measures over a short period of time, the carryover effect is potentially important. I'm curious how you've thought about that.
Yeah, that's also a recognized problem in this literature. It's called reactivity. And the worry is that you sensitize people to certain things, so they start to notice them and they start to respond to them. And so we can look at that statistically particularly in terms of things like autocorrelation, and look and see if there's an increasing trend in the scores. So that would suggest that. So we will have to pay attention to that, because it is a very important concern.
But more than reactivity, as they learn the measurement process, there may be other kinds of trends going on. So there can be a complex set of trends. Their appreciation of social desirability may hit a third of the way through the measurements, or just simply remembering what they answered previously and wanting to sharpen that, or thinking that you're going to take their answers from a previous time in the context of the current time, and so they change them in that context, which has been shown in survey research. So not all of those will produce the same kinds of trends that you can factor out that way.
Right. Yeah, no, there's no simple answer to your question. It's one of the drawbacks of the method. So it's something that we'll have to cope with the best we can, using established methods to do that. And then it's one of those things you just have to own as a limitation of a particular brand. I mean, we're also interested in experimental study. We're going to do the qualitative interviews. So we really understand that any one particular method is always going to have clear limitations, and you hit on one right there.
Darsha. I was wondering about the the participants, whether you've thought about what kind of work place they have, because some people work alone most of the time, so they're not going to have much social contact, right? So that'll influence what kind of data you collect, and others stay home a lot, right? So they have lots of personal stuff, but not very much impersonal. So anyway, have you thought about all those?
Yes, we have. There are a few things that we're going to do about that. One is that we will be monitoring the responses. So if there are people who are repeatedly not in contexts where they have the opportunity for kindness or justice or fairness, then we'll know that pretty early on. The other thing is with multi-level modeling, you can get away with quite a bit of missing data. So that's a strength of the method that will play to our advantage in this case, because certainly there will be times when people say, no, I didn't see anybody for the last 2 hours. So yeah, that is important.
Dan?
Blaine, I'm interested in your use of the term full virtue. And I wonder if you're making a gesture towards a unity of virtue view of character when you're in your use of the term. And I guess I want to follow up on Darsha's question too. I'm not sure what you want to find. You expect to find that there's going to be variability in individuals over time, right? But then you want to find self-integration also. And as you map the distribution of character traits over time, does that interact at all with the kinds of contexts in which people find themselves? I would imagine that self and context interact in complex ways. There might be some contexts that just won't elicit fairness and kindness, and I wonder how that maps in. I'm sure this is a naive question, but I wonder how that maps into what you expect to find in variability in the distribution of traits.
You want to talk about the full virtue?
I hope there's a...
I mean, the full virtue thing, I mean, yeah, we're not going to make any kind of assumption about the unity of virtues at all. I mean, so I think the background assumption here is that we've got to deny the unity of virtues because we're thinking someone could have some degree of virtue even if they don't have all the characteristic marks. So if someone doesn't say they're not taking pleasure in it, Aristotle would just say they're just continent. So it looks like, in his view, they're certainly not virtuous. So we're already, I think, being much more loose with the use of saying someone has some degree of virtue than Aristotle would on his actual theory. And I think the same thing about the unity of virtues. We're not going to say someone doesn't have virtue if they don't have all of them. So any kind of strong thesis like that. There's another way the unity of virtue thesis has been developed by people like Dan Russell, where if you're trying to do a conceptual analysis of the nature of the virtue concepts, you need to deploy the notion of the unity of virtues. We actually, I mean, so that's not going to be part of the project, but I actually think that's compatible with what we're doing and actually I think is plausible. But that's not going to be built into the measurements. That's more the way you understand the concepts philosophically.
Owen.
Okay, do I have time to answer a second question? Oh.
Owen.
I just have a quick question about, in reading the proposal and also in what you said, the fairness, kindness study. I'm wondering about, you mentioned, I think, 4 questions that are asked about fairness or something like that. How substantive a view is being, as it were, is embedded in that? I mean, I don't have the questions in front of me, but there are just different notions of fairness. So I'm just curious about that. I'm sure you're sensitive to that and keeping your eyes on it, but I'm just curious about what the research instrument there looks like.
Well, the research instrument is not yet created, so
Okay.
that's part of what we're going to be doing if we are funded. So I can't tell you that for sure, but I can tell you we will pay attention to that. And the reminder is really helpful because it's absolutely critical not to take too narrow a view on that so that we're ruling out things that many people would consider fair just by our questions.
Just a really quick addition, because some people will say, it relates a little bit to unity of virtues problem, that it actually is ultimately hard to individuate or separate out being, say, a fair person from being a kind person. And sort of some of these virtues blend together, at least on certain cultural conceptions or social conceptions. So there's a delicacy there that I would just encourage you to be sensitive to. So, thanks.
Great point, thanks, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, we're also going to have to worry about when you're asking questions to people, you're not going to be able to impose whatever conception of the virtue you're wanting to operate with on them. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing we've realized we're just going to have to battle it out and try to do the best we can. But yeah, it's going to be a challenge. So.
I think one answer to that question is to use terms that don't import a whole lot of content, that leave it up to the individual's discretion to say whether it's kindness or fairness. That's one approach. And we're just going to have to really think about that hard and work on it hard.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much for your presentation.